No one noticed him at first. He was just another face in the crowd, standing near the edge of the square, holding a small paper cup of tea that had already gone cold. He had come early because he always came early. That was how he lived his life. Early to work, early to help, early to leave before trouble found him. He did not like attention, and attention usually did not like him either. The city was busy that morning. Flags hung from buildings, moving slowly in the warm air. Police stood in neat lines, their faces serious but calm. People whispered and checked their phones, waiting for the arrival that had been talked about for weeks. The royal procession was coming. It was meant to be peaceful. It was meant to remind everyone that the old line still stood, still breathed, still mattered. He did not care much for royalty. Not out of anger, but out of distance. That world felt far from his own. His life was simple. He worked long hours, sent money home, and kept his head down. He believed that if you caused no trouble, trouble would pass you by. That belief had served him well until that day. As the sound of drums rolled through the street, the crowd leaned forward like a single body. Children were lifted onto shoulders. Phones rose into the air. He stayed where he was, close to a barrier, close to an exit. Old habits stayed strong. The first vehicle appeared, slow and polished, shining under the sun. Cheers followed, then another. Everything felt planned, controlled, almost too perfect. He felt it before he saw it, a tightness in his chest, a strange silence inside the noise. Years of watching people had taught him that danger often arrived quietly. His eyes moved without thinking. He noticed a man pushing forward, not cheering, not smiling. The man's hands were tight, his steps rushed but hidden by the crowd's movement. Security did not see it. They were watching the wide picture, not the small details. The royal carriage slowed as it passed the square. Inside, behind glass, sat the future of the bloodline. Young, unaware, looking out with curiosity rather than fear. The sight made something twist inside him. He thought of home, family, of how fragile life really was. The man in the crowd moved again, faster now. Too fast, there was no time to think. He dropped the cup. It hit the ground and spilled, unnoticed. His body moved before his mind caught up. He stepped forward, pushing through 2 people, then 3. Someone shouted in surprise. Someone else cursed. The man in the crowd reached inside his jacket. In that moment, everything slowed. He did not see a royal figure. He did not see power or history. He saw a human life about to be shattered. He threw himself forward. The impact was hard and sudden. He collided with the man, driving him sideways into the barrier. Both fell. The sound was ugly. The crowd screamed. Security rushed in, too late and just in time. He felt pain explode across his shoulder and back, but he held on. He had learned long ago that letting go was sometimes worse than holding on too long. The man struggled beneath him, angry and desperate. But strong arms pulled them apart. Within seconds, the square was no longer a celebration. It was noise, fear, confusion. He was dragged away, his feet barely touching the ground. He did not resist. He did not speak. His heart pounded so hard, he thought it might break through his chest. He was taken behind a line of vehicles, out of sight. Someone asked him questions, fast and sharp. He answered slowly, carefully. He told the truth because he had nothing else to give. I saw something wrong, he said. I acted. That was all they searched him. They searched his bag. They found nothing but work gloves, a folded note with a phone number, and a cheap wallet worn thin from use. The officers looked at each other, uncertain. In the distance, the procession stopped. Doors closed. Engines started. The royal bloodline was moved away, untouched. He sat on the curb, hands shaking, while medics checked him. The pain was settling in now, deep and heavy. A bruise was already forming. Someone offered him water. He nodded and drank, staring at the ground. He did not know what would happen next. He only knew that something had changed. Later, much later, when the noise had faded and the square was empty again, He was allowed to leave. No applause followed him. No cameras pointed his way. His name was not spoken. He walked home alone, each step heavier than the last. That night, he did not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the moment again. The reaching hand. The choice. The impact. He wondered what would have happened if he had stayed still. He did not like the answer. By morning, the news was everywhere, though the details were thin. An attempted breach? A quick response. No casualties. The royal family safe. Commentators praised security. The crowd moved on. His phone rang once. Then again, unknown numbers. He did not answer. He went to work as usual. His shoulder ached. His back burned. But routine was a comfort. Around midday, 2 people arrived at his workplace. They wore plain clothes but carried authority like a second skin. They asked to speak with him privately. In a quiet room, they thanked him. Not loudly. Not warmly, carefully. They explained that what he had done mattered more than he could understand. They said he needed to answer more questions. For safety reasons, he agreed. What else could he do? As he followed them out, he looked back once at the life he knew. It felt smaller already, like a room he had outgrown without trying. Far away. Behind walls and guards, the Queen was being told about the man in the crowd. Not his name. Not his past. Just his actions. She listened in silence. Her face did not change, but her hands tightened slightly. A life had been spared. A bloodline protected, and an ordinary man had stepped into a story he could no longer leave. He returned to his small apartment, but it felt different now. The walls, once familiar, seemed taller, narrower, more pressing. His life had shifted in ways he could not yet name. The morning news had barely mentioned him, yet everywhere he went, eyes seemed to watch just a little longer. People whispered just a little quieter. He told himself it was his imagination, but deep down, he knew it was not. At work, nothing had changed. The machines hummed. Papers stacked. Phones rang. Yet every time a door opened, every time someone walked past, his attention flicked to the sound. He felt a strange mixture of fear and pride. He had acted, saved a life, perhaps more than one. And now he was in the middle of something far bigger than himself. By afternoon, 2 plainclothed people arrived again. They carried a quiet authority that made the air heavier. They introduced themselves as investigators, though they avoided details. They asked questions about the incident, about his routine, about his past. He answered honestly, giving no embellishments, no personal insights beyond what was necessary. Every answer felt like another thread pulling him deeper into a world he had never known. They need to know everything, one of them said. Her voice was calm, precise, almost gentle, but it carried an unspoken weight. For your safety and theirs. He nodded, not fully understanding who they were or why it mattered. After hours of questions, they left, leaving him with a quiet apartment that suddenly felt empty and echoing. That night he could not sleep. Every sound in the building seemed louder, every shadow longer. Memories of the square played in his mind, the cheering crowd, the sudden movement of the man, the panic, the impact. He remembered the small, fragile hand of the air behind the carriage glass, the shock in the eyes of security guards. He had acted on instinct. But instinct had placed him in the center of something monumental. The next day, things changed again. A letter arrived, handwritten, addressed simply, "For your courage." It contained no signature, no stamp, no hint of where it came from. Inside was a small note. "Your actions saved lives. You may not understand fully now, but the truth will be revealed. Remain careful." "You are not alone," kept the note in his pocket, feeling the weight of the paper against his thigh. A constant reminder that the world he had walked in for decades was suddenly much larger, much more dangerous. He knew one thing. He could not go back to ignorance. The life he had known, the quiet, ordinary life, was gone. By midweek, he noticed changes in his routines. People seemed to recognize him more often. Some avoided him. Others looked at him with cautious curiosity. The security cameras outside his apartment building were new. He knew this not from seeing the cameras themselves, but from the subtle, almost imperceptible adjustments of the men stationed nearby. They moved in patterns, watching, learning. He met them one evening in the small park near his apartment. They introduced themselves fully now, explaining their role. They were part of a group assigned to protect the royal family and ensure that anyone would come into contact with threats was safe. They did not say that he was now part of their responsibility, but he understood it without words. "You will have people checking on you." "Yes," one said. "But do not worry. You are not in danger from your actions today. You are in danger from the world that wanted to harm them. That danger is still out there." He swallowed hard. "I don't know if I want to be part of this world. Sometimes life chooses for us," another said. "Sometimes courage cannot be unchosen." Days turned into weeks. Investigations unfolded quietly. He was called to give statements, tested for knowledge of procedures, asked about every detail of that morning. Every question made him more aware of the gravity of what had occurred. The more he learned, the more he realized that the royal bloodline had been under threat in ways the public could never see. He had unknowingly stepped into a long-standing danger. One afternoon, he was taken to a secure location, a private room in a government building that felt both familiar and foreign. Maps covered the walls. Photographs pinned with notes and strings crisscrossed like spiderwebs. He saw images of men and women he had never met, all connected to threats against the family he had saved. The scale of it shocked him. The world he had lived in was small, but this world was vast, layered, and unseen. He realized that the life of the royal family was protected by many layers, yet one single breach could still cause disaster. And he had just become one of those layers, whether he wanted to be or not. The thought both frightened and inspired him. Courage, he realized, was not about the absence of fear. It was about action in the presence of fear. That night, he walked through the city alone, feeling the hum of life around him. Streetlights glinted off puddles left from an earlier rain. Vendors packed up their stalls. Children laughed in the distance. He felt a connection to the world he had always known and the world he had just entered. Both were real, both were fragile, and both were in need of protection. He thought about the air, about the face pressed to the carriage glass, eyes wide with innocence and trust. That image stayed with him, a quiet but powerful motivator. It reminded him that heroism was not about recognition or reward. It was about choices, and the courage to make them in the moment they mattered most. In the following days, the Queen herself took notice. Not publicly, not yet, but through reports, through those who observed him and spoke of his actions. She learned that he had not sought attention, that he had not panicked, that he had acted with instinct and with care. In a world full of calculated moves and hidden agendas, his honesty and bravery stood out like a single bright flame. Her advisors debated what to do. Should he be brought closer, acknowledged, given reward, trained, or kept at a distance? The Queen watched silently, considering what it meant to recognize someone who acted without expectation. Someone who had risked life and limb for others with no thought of self. His presence, though ordinary on the surface, had revealed an extraordinary strength. He, meanwhile, returned to his small routines as much as possible, though everything had changed. His work, his small walks. Even his meals were now viewed through the lens of someone who had stepped into a story far bigger than himself. He felt a strange combination of isolation and importance, of invisibility and scrutiny. One evening, he received another note, this one delivered with more care. The world is watching. Not all for harm, some for hope. Trust the instinct that led you to act. No signature again. He folded it carefully and placed it in the small box where he kept his few personal items. It was not comfort. It was acknowledgement. A quiet confirmation that the life he had led and the courage he had shown had meaning beyond measure. He went to sleep that night feeling the weight of responsibility pressing against his chest, yet also a strange lightness. He had stepped into danger and survived. He had protected lives and bloodlines. and though the world had shifted around him, he knew that he was ready for whatever came next. His ordinary life was over. Something extraordinary had begun. He found himself slowly drawn into a world he had never imagined. It was not grand or glittering as one might think. The royal family's private life was careful, measured, and full of quiet rules that were not written anywhere. He was allowed to observe, to learn, to be present, though always at a distance that respected their world, yet demanded his patience. The first few days were strange. He moved from his small apartment to a temporary place provided by the people assigned to watch over him. It was simple, comfortable, and secure. He kept to himself mostly, reading newspapers, walking in small parks, and reflecting on how abruptly his ordinary life had ended. There were small notes left for him, reminders that he was now under observation, yet treated with a level of care that felt foreign and slightly alarming. Then he saw them. For the first time, he was brought to a private garden within the royal grounds. He did not see guards at first, only green lawns, neatly trimmed hedges, and flowers in precise rows. There the air was playing quietly, a child of curiosity and energy, aware that the world outside was a constant threat. The innocence was striking. The man realized that the stakes were higher than he had known. This child, these lives, were fragile and precious. The air noticed him immediately, eyes wide with both curiosity and trust. The child approached slowly, steps careful, as if testing a new friend. He knelt, letting the child see that he had no sudden movements, no threat. A small hand reached for his, and for a moment felt the weight of everything he had done and everything that might still be asked of him. He smiled softly, letting the child know he was safe. That day, and in the days that followed, he learned the quiet rhythm of the royal household. He saw moments of play, moments of learning, moments of strict rules. He saw the queen not in public splendor, but in private thought, moving with a careful pace. Her eyes sharp yet tender, always observing, always judging. She noticed him as well, though she did not approach. Instead, she sent reports, quietly watching the man who had risked everything for the bloodline. He was introduced to staff, security, and advisors. Everyone seemed to measure him, not with suspicion, but with careful calculation. He noticed their doubts, their silent debates over what to do with him. Was he a hero? A liability? A stranger who had acted on instinct? He did not care about titles or labels. He only knew he had done what he felt was right. Days turned into weeks. He began to understand the subtle language of trust within the palace. A look from the queen could speak more than words. A gesture from the air could convey pure honesty. He realized that to act, to protect, to stay present, he needed more than courage. He needed patience, observation, and restraint. One afternoon, a situation arose that tested him beyond what he expected. A minor security alert occurred, something the public would never know, a shadow moving where it should not have been. The guards were alert, but he noticed it first, sensing the disruption before anyone else. Without hesitation, he moved, placing himself between the potential danger and the air, signaling to the guards at the right moment, preventing panic, preventing harm. Once again, instinct guided him, and once again he realized that his actions were no longer casual, but part of a larger responsibility. Afterward, the queen summoned him briefly. He entered a room where sunlight spilled softly across a table. She did not speak immediately, only studied him. Her eyes were sharp, her judgment quiet but undeniable. "You understand more than most," she said finally. "You act not out of desire for reward, but because it is right. That is rare," he nodded. Words failed him. He had not sought recognition. He had only acted. "That will not always protect you," she continued. "You will need guidance, training, and awareness. The world you stepped into is not the one you knew." He understood. For the first time, he realized that heroism was not a single act, but a continuous choice. A commitment that demanded more than courage. It demanded wisdom, patience, and vigilance. Over the next weeks, he spent time learning. The lessons were quiet but profound. He learned how to read subtle signs of danger, how to move without drawing attention, how to act in a crowd to protect without causing panic. He was taught by those who had spent years in the shadows of protection. Guardians who never sought recognition, who acted silently for the sake of others. He absorbed everything, knowing that his instincts had brought him this far. But knowledge would carry him further. He also began to see the human side of the royal family. The heir laughed, played, and learned as any child would, despite the circumstances. The queen, behind her composed exterior, carried worry and tenderness in equal measure. He understood that the crown was not merely a symbol, but a weight, and that protecting it meant protecting the human beings beneath it. As days passed, small gestures began to emerge. The heir would sometimes seek him out, offering a small toy or sharing a quiet moment. The queen, in reports and in rare private words, acknowledged his dedication and composure. He felt a bond forming, not from titles or recognition, but from mutual understanding and respect. The outside world remained unaware. News reports celebrated security and preparation, never mentioning him. The streets were busy, people continued their lives, and the danger, though present, was invisible. He liked it this way. Heroism, he realized, did not need applause. Yet, he could not ignore the shadow that followed him, the awareness that danger was never far. Each day carried a quiet tension, a constant need for awareness. He could not relax completely. He could not pretend that the world he had known still existed. The man who had once walked unnoticed now carried responsibility that weighed on his every step. One evening, as he walked through the palace garden alone, he reflected on how his life had changed. The quiet streets of his old neighborhood, the small apartment, the simple routines, all were memories now. He had stepped into a story that demanded courage, observation, and understanding beyond his years, and he had learned slowly that his presence mattered, that his instincts, choices, and care could protect life itself. He returned to his temporary apartment, knowing that the days ahead would be filled with both challenge and learning. But for the first time, he also felt a sense of belonging. He was part of a world that moved quietly, measuredly, but with stakes that were high and profoundly real. He had begun to understand the weight of what he protected, and the bond forming quietly between him and the family he had saved. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone else, but it was real. As night fell, he looked out over the city, thinking about the moments that had led him here. He thought about courage, about choice, about instinct and action, and he realized that the man who had stood in the square, who had thrown himself forward without thought for reward, was now part of something much larger, something that required him, needed him, and had already begun to change him forever. Days passed quietly, almost deceptively so. He had settled into a routine within the royal grounds, learning to read the subtle shifts in the environment, small gestures of the staff, and the silent warnings that only those trained could perceive. Every step, every movement carried weight. He was no longer a man who could act without thought. His actions now held consequences that reached beyond himself. Then the alert came. It was small, almost imperceptible to anyone not trained to notice it. A guard spotted movement in a restricted area, a shadow where there should be none. The warning was brief, almost like a whisper, but he heard it immediately. His instincts sharpened. He felt a familiar surge of tension in his chest. That same tightness that had propelled him into action weeks ago. He did not hesitate. Moving swiftly, he positioned himself between the potential threat and the air. Every muscle in his body tensed, every sense heightened. The shadow moved faster, and he realized it was a person, intent, unclear, energy-focused, dangerous. He could see the determination in the figure, the quiet but deadly resolve. He could not afford mistakes. Security arrived moments later, but he had already guided the heir to a safer position, hidden behind a column and out of sight. The shadow figure lunged, and he intercepted instinctively, using his body to absorb the first impact. Pain shot through him, sharp and burning, but he did not falter. He had learned through training to control fear, to channel adrenaline, to act decisively. The struggle was brief but intense. Guards arrived, and the intruder was subdued, restrained, and removed without harm to the child or anyone else. In the chaos, he felt bruises forming, his body trembling from effort and adrenaline. But the weight of relief of having acted correctly settled over him as he watched the air safe. Later, he was escorted to a quiet room. Medics attended to his injuries, cleaning cuts, and bandaging bruises. He said nothing, only nodded when asked questions. His body ached, but his mind was alert, processing every detail, replaying the movements, the timing, the choices. He knew that in moments like these, one decision could mean life or death, safety or disaster. Afterward, he was called to a private audience with the Queen. He entered the room, cautious but composed. The Queen stood by the window, sunlight casting a soft glow across the room, highlighting her composed yet intense expression. She motioned for him to sit. He did, careful not to show the strain of his injuries. "You acted again," she said quietly but firmly. "Without hesitation, without thought for yourself." He looked at her, words caught in his throat. There was no flattery, no praise, only acknowledgement, and a weight that carried more meaning than any medal or title could. "You have shown qualities that go beyond courage," she continued. "You have shown loyalty, awareness, and instinct that cannot be taught. You are part of something greater now, whether you wish it or not." He nodded, feeling the gravity of her words. He had never sought recognition. He had only acted because it was right, because instinct demanded it, because he could not stand by and do nothing. Yet now, his choices had placed him at the center of a world he had barely understood. The Queen approached, her presence commanding, but not intimidating. She placed a hand lightly on the table, her eyes never leaving his. "From this moment on," she said, her voice steady and deliberate, "you are ours. Not by title, not by duty, but by the actions you have taken and the courage you have shown. You are part of the family you have protected. Understand this clearly. Your presence, your decisions, and your loyalty matter to us more than you can imagine." He felt a strange mix of pride and fear. Pride because the acknowledgement came from someone of such authority, someone whose judgment mattered immensely. Fear because the declaration carried responsibility he had not anticipated, a permanence he had never imagined. He realized that he could no longer walk away from this world. He had entered it fully, and there was no retreat in the days that followed. The acknowledgement transformed his interactions. Staff treated him with cautious respect. The air sought his company more openly, and the Queen's silent observation became a quiet reassurance. He began to feel a bond that was invisible to others, a thread connecting him to lives he had saved, and to a family that had recognized his courage. He continued his training, but now it was different. He trained not only for skill, but for understanding, for anticipation, for the ability to act decisively under pressure. Every day carried lessons not just of movement or strategy, but of patience, observation, and the subtle language of trust that existed within the royal household. He learned to read expressions, to sense tension, to act before danger became visible. Despite the recognition and responsibility, he remained humble. He did not seek attention. He did not desire rewards. His satisfaction came from the quiet moments, the small gestures of trust, the knowledge that he had protected lives and bloodlines from harm. The Queen's declaration was a constant reminder, a binding acknowledgement that his role was crucial and irreplaceable. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he walked through the palace gardens, reflecting on the path that had led him here. He thought of the square where it had all begun, the ordinary morning transformed into extraordinary responsibility. He realized that heroism was not a single act, but a continuous choice. It was courage in the presence of fear, awareness in the presence of chaos, and loyalty without expectation. The shadow of danger remained, always present, always possible. But he had learned to move with it, to anticipate it, and to protect those who could not protect themselves. The bond formed with the royal family, invisible to the world, but real in every gesture. Every glance, every silent acknowledgement gave him purpose. It was a purpose he had not sought, but had accepted with full understanding. As night fell, he looked out over the city, thinking of the moments that had defined him. The declaration of the Queen, simple in words, but immense in meaning, had changed him forever. He was no longer an ordinary man. He was a protector, a guardian, a part of a world larger than he had ever known. And he was ready, despite fear, despite pain, despite uncertainty, to continue walking the path he had chosen, bound by courage, loyalty, and the acknowledgement that he belonged to something greater than himself. The days that followed the Queen's declaration were filled with a new rhythm, one that balanced caution with purpose. He had become a part of a world he had never imagined, yet he still carried the simple habits of his old life. He woke early, drank his tea, walked in quiet streets before anyone else stirred, and allowed himself moments of reflection. But each step now was measured with awareness, every decision shaded by the knowledge that his actions could affect lives beyond his own. The royal family's presence was a constant. Though their world remained largely invisible to the public, he spent time with the heir, who grew to trust him implicitly. The child sought him out for stories, for quiet games, and even for simple conversations that required no words. There was comfort in these moments, an understanding that the bond they shared could never be broken. Formed as it was in shared experiences of safety, care, and instinct, the Queen continued to watch him, her acknowledgement silent but ever present. She allowed him to move freely within the boundaries of the household, while subtly guiding his development. His responsibilities expanded, but not with pressure or expectation, only with trust. He learned not only to act in the moment of danger, but to anticipate, to read situations before they became crises. The lessons were patient and deliberate, teaching him the nuance of vigilance, the weight of protection, and the delicate balance between freedom and responsibility. Outside, the world remained unaware of the full story. News reports continued to praise security, but they never mentioned him. It suited him well. Recognition was not something he sought. The quiet gratitude, the trust, the bond with the lives he had saved, these were enough. Yet, in his quiet moments, he reflected on how drastically life had shifted. He had entered a story far beyond what he had ever expected, and there was no turning back. His body carried the marks of previous struggles, faint bruises and soreness, reminders of the mornings when instinct had propelled him into action. Pain and fatigue were constant companions, but they were tempered by purpose. He had learned that endurance was more than physical, it was emotional, mental, and moral. He carried the weight of responsibility lightly in action, but heavily in awareness, understanding that the quiet moments between crises were often the most important. Occasionally, he was allowed brief visits outside the grounds, always accompanied or observed. Yet these moments reminded him of the ordinary world he had left behind. Streets, markets, parks, they all seemed familiar, yet subtly changed through the lens of someone who had seen the fragility of life and the importance of courage. He walked among the people unnoticed, yet ever aware that danger could be anywhere, that protection required both presence and perception. He also became a teacher in his own way, sharing lessons of instinct, awareness, and calm under pressure with those who sought guidance within the household. Not formal training, not lectures, but quiet examples, demonstrations, and shared moments that taught by showing rather than telling. Staff and guards began to see him not only as a protector, but as a guide, a person whose experience and insight could quietly shape the actions of others. One evening, as he walked through the garden where he had first observed the heir, he reflected on the journey that had led him here. The memory of that ordinary morning in the square, the panic, the instinctive leap forward, and the immediate consequences, they seemed distant now, yet they remained vivid. The courage of a single act had reshaped his life, his understanding of responsibility, and his place in a world that moved silently. With stakes far beyond ordinary perception, the Queen invited him for a private moment, not in ceremony, but in quiet acknowledgement. They spoke briefly, not of danger, not of duty, but of human connection, of the subtle ways courage and kindness ripple through life, touching those we may never know. Her words were simple but profound, reinforcing what he had already learned, that heroism is measured not by recognition, but by the impact of quiet, selfless action. He realized that his life had been forever altered, that the ordinary man who had once walked unnoticed now carried responsibilities and bonds that could never be undone. Yet, he did not resent it. He embraced it, understanding that the path he had been thrust onto required vigilance, care, and compassion. His choices, once spontaneous and instinctive, were now tempered by knowledge and experience, yet guided by the same courage that had saved a life and, by extension, a bloodline. He spent nights reflecting, planning and preparing, yet also finding moments of peace. In the quiet, he read books, walked under starlit skies, and allowed himself the simple pleasures of human existence. Yet always awareness remained, a steady companion, reminding him that the safety of others depended on him. He had learned that protection was not just a moment of action, but a life lived with awareness and responsibility. Time passed, and the bond with the heir and the royal family deepened. They relied on him, trusted him, and in turn, he learned to trust them. There was a mutual understanding, unspoken but palpable, that the life of the family and the strength of the bond they shared were inseparable from the choices he made every day. Eventually, he accepted that recognition by the public was unnecessary. The quiet moments, the small gestures, the trust of those whose lives he had touched, that was enough. He found contentment in the balance of ordinary habits and extraordinary responsibility, understanding that life, in its simplest and most profound forms, required courage, patience, and integrity. He had become more than the man who had acted instinctively in the square. He had become a guardian, a protector, and a silent witness to a world few could see. And though danger remained ever present, and though life would continue to challenge him in unexpected ways, he knew he had found a place where courage mattered, where trust was sacred, and where his presence could change the course of lives quietly but forever. As dawn broke one morning, he walked through the palace gardens, the heir laughing nearby, the queen watching from a distance, and he understood fully that the man who had acted without thought or expectation had now become a part of something enduring, something larger than himself. He had protected the royal bloodline, and in doing so, had found a life filled with purpose, connection, and responsibility. And though he remained humble, simple, and unassuming, he knew the truth. He would never be ordinary again. He had been claimed, not by title, not by duty, but by courage, trust, and the quiet acknowledgement of a life saved. He was theirs as much as they were his, and together they moved forward, bound by shared experience, loyalty, and the understanding that some choices define us forever. Life continued. But it was never quite the same as it had been before he intervened that fateful day. The ordinary routines he had once relied upon were now interwoven with responsibility, trust, and a quiet awareness that danger could appear at any time. Even in the calmest moments, he felt the weight of the past weeks and months pressing on him, reminding him that courage was not a single act, but a continuous way of living. He spent his mornings walking through the palace gardens, observing the intricate balance of nature, the calm of a world seemingly untouched by chaos. The heir ran ahead, laughing and calling out his innocence, untouched by the shadows that stalked beyond the walls. Watching the child, he felt a profound sense of purpose, a responsibility that went beyond duty or obligation. It was personal. He was not just protecting a life. He was safeguarding hope, continuity, the very essence of family. The queen's presence remained a guiding force in his life. She did not intervene unnecessarily, but her quiet observation, her occasional words, and the trust she placed in him carried immense weight. She understood what he had done, what he had become, and what his role meant, not just for the royal household, but for the lives that intertwined with it. Her declaration that he belonged to them was not a formality. It was recognition of his humanity, his courage, and his unyielding instinct to protect. He spent afternoons training, not just in physical preparedness, but in awareness, strategy, and observation. The people around him taught him the subtle arts of protection, the understanding that danger was not always visible, that sometimes the greatest threats came in the smallest gestures, the quietest movements. He learned to notice patterns, to anticipate actions, to read the unspoken language of human behavior. Each lesson was a reminder that vigilance was a daily practice, not a momentary choice. The staff and guards had begun to rely on him, not because of his authority, but because of his skill and instinct. They sought his guidance in small ways: how to approach situations with calm, how to protect without causing panic, how to move with quiet precision. In these moments, he realized that leadership did not always require titles or recognition. Sometimes it was the ability to act correctly, consistently, with integrity that earned respect and trust. Evenings were quiet. He often sat alone, reflecting on the chain of events that had led him here. He thought about the square, the moment he had leapt forward without hesitation, and the consequences that had followed. That single act had shaped a lifetime, creating bonds that could never be severed, responsibilities that could never be ignored. He understood that courage had ripple effects, touching lives in ways that were not immediately visible, shaping destinies quietly but profoundly. There were nights when he felt the weight of exhaustion, when the pain of past injuries and the mental strain of vigilance made him question his endurance. Yet, each time he reminded himself of the stakes of the lives that depended on him and the quiet promise he had made to protect, regardless of recognition or reward. He had chosen this path, and though it demanded much, it also offered clarity, purpose, and a connection to something larger than himself. The air grew increasingly confident and curious. He sought out the man who had protected him, not just for safety, but for guidance, for companionship, for trust. Together, they explored the gardens, the quiet corridors, and the small spaces of the palace. In these moments, he saw the impact of his presence, the way trust and courage could shape the growth of a child, how protection and guidance could be a form of love in its purest sense. The Queen occasionally joined these moments, offering subtle lessons in grace, responsibility, and observation. She spoke of the importance of patience, the value of quiet strength, the ways in which one could influence the world without seeking glory. Her guidance was measured, deliberate, and always aligned with the understanding that he had earned her trust through action, not words. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. He began to see the subtle patterns of life within the palace, the routines, the unspoken rules, the quiet signals that indicated calm or disruption. He learned to move within this world seamlessly, balancing his own instincts with the rhythms of those around him. It was a delicate dance, requiring both discipline and intuition, a combination he had developed through experience and reflection.